Hey, this is Jeff, and welcome back. In this episode, I'm going to be making the raised panels that go inside of the doors. And I'm using just big box store deck boards. So these are cedar deck boards. I'm starting by ripping off one edge square. I'm going to do that on all of these boards, then flip them around momentarily, rip off the other side, and then with just a tiny bit of cleanup, those are ready for glue up. So now ripping the second side, so in addition to getting a nice flat square surface for gluing, it also takes off the rounded edges of the board so that when they come together into a panel, it's nice and flat without ridges where those rounded parts were. So if you've seen the video I did on making the fire pit cover, this is going to look very familiar. So that was really sort of a test project to make sure I was going to be comfortable getting a nice flat solid panel from these cedar deck boards. Obviously that turned out really well. I was pleased with it, and so now we're gluing these up to make the raised panels to go into a long-term permanent installed door, which I'm comfortable is going to last for a very, very long time. With the glue all dry and cleaned up, I'm now marking one square edge. So I'm using a reference edge, a square, so I now have two edges that are perfect 90 degrees from one another. I mark that so I remember which those reference edges are, and then I will rip this using my track saw. So the track saw lets me just line up on that mark I made. You could certainly do this clamping an edge guide with a regular circular saw, but having a track saw makes this super simple. Then I check to make sure that I got a perfect 90 degrees here, so I now have two reference edges to take this guy over to the table saw. First, I'm going to rip this panel to the appropriate width. Then I cross-cut it to the proper length. So you can really only do this cut if you've made sure that those two edges are perfectly square to one another, and you make sure you're cutting against the reference edges. In case the other guys aren't parallel, you could end up with something wonky other than a nice perfect rectangle. Now with the panel at its final finished size, I'm just going to use some hand plane work, get these surfaces cleaned up, flat, true, and relatively smooth, though they're going to get some sanding later on before finishing. So this is the beginning of the process for making the raised panels. There's a number of different ways you can do this. You can do it on the table saw, you can do it with a giant router bit or a shaper. So I'm using one of the more straightforward methods here. So with the blade set for the correct height and distance from the end, I'm really cutting and creating the field that will be the raised panel portion that when we lift this board over here you can see that. So just 4 straight cuts across, and those define the edges of the field. So now with the field defined and I have the blade tilted here, I'm cutting the actual raised portion to create the bevel on all these edges. Getting this set up is kind of finicky, so you really just end up doing a whole bunch of test cuts and adjusting the height and the angle until you get it right. But once you do, and you get that coming out right at the defined cut of the field with the nice angle you want, it's always a fun point to flip that over and see that nice looking raised panel in your hand. So from this end-on perspective, I think you can see an awful lot better the effect of having that tilted blade in there, creating the bevel, and having that stop right at the previous cut that we made before, creating the field and now the beveled edges. So with hand planes now, we'll just sort of clean up the machine marks left from the saw. It's hard to hold this panel perfectly square and keep it that way as it passes through the blade. So you get a little chatter, pretty easily cleaned up. And then using a rabbet plane, I just clean up the transition. So it's a very, very nice, square, well demarked edge from the panel to the bevel. Now using a dado stack, I'm just putting a rabbet on the back and trying to get the thickness just right so I have a nice secure fit within the edges of the door, but I want it to be able to move without being, too loose in there. So sneaking up on that fit to get it just right. And I do the majority of the work here on the table saw and then follow that with some more cleanup on the bench with a hand plane. So here we are back at the bench for a final fit. Just keep checking and planing until you're really comfortable with the fit, and then at the end, before assembling the door, do a final fit with all the pieces just to make sure you get a nice, secure, snug fit that can move as this panel expands and contracts with humidity and weather. So with that, we wrap up, finish off the preparation of the raised panels. We're getting ready to move on to constructing the door, and thanks for watching.